Hashtag at 83, a letter finally revealed what happened to his SEAL team. The morning it all came back, Thomas Earl Calloway was doing what he did every morning. Sitting on the back porch of his small house in Kingsport, Tennessee, drinking black coffee and watching the sun come up over the ridge. He was 83 years old. His hands shook a little now, not bad enough to spill the coffee, but enough that he noticed. He always noticed. A man who spent 30 years paying attention to every detail of his own body doesn't stop doing that just because the wars are over. The house was quiet. It had been quiet for 11 years, ever since Margaret passed. His daughter called on Sundays. His grandson drove up from Knoxville every couple of months. The neighbors waved from across the street. It was a decent life. A small life, but decent. He didn't ask for more than that anymore. There was a vegetable garden along the back fence that he tended himself. Tomatoes, mostly, a few rows of beans. He didn't need the food. The grocery store was 4 miles down the road, but he needed the work. He needed something to tend to. Something that required him to show up every day and pay attention. Some habits don't die. They just find a new shape. He heard the mail truck before he saw it. The sound of the engine, the squeak of the little door on the box at the end of the driveway. He didn't get up right away. He finished his coffee first. At 83, you stop rushing for things that can wait. When he finally walked down the driveway, there was a small stack of envelopes in the box. Electric bill, a grocery store circular, and something else. A thick manila envelope, slightly battered at the corners, with a return address from Washington, D.C. Not a government office. Not a law firm. A private address, handwritten in blue ink and handwriting Thomas didn't recognize. He stood at the end of his driveway holding it for a long moment. His coffee was still warm in his other hand. He knew, before he opened it, that whatever was inside was going to cost him something. He didn't know what. He didn't know how much. But he knew, the way old soldiers always know, that some things announce themselves before they arrive. He went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. It was 1984 when Thomas Calloway first arrived in Little Creek, Virginia, as a freshly minted Navy SEAL. He was 24 years old, lean as a rail, and absolutely certain he was the toughest man alive. Bud Sess had a way of doing that to you, taking something ordinary and grinding it down until only the essential remained, and then convincing you that what was left was exceptional. He was wrong about being the toughest man alive. He figured that out pretty quickly. The man who corrected his thinking was Senior Chief Petty Officer Dale Hutchins, who was from Odessa, Texas, and had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of something harder than wood. Dale was 32. Already a veteran of operations Thomas didn't have clearance to know about, and he had a laugh that could rattle the windows and a temper that could make the air feel thick and dangerous. Dale was the first person who shook Thomas's hand and called him brother. He meant it. That was the thing about Dale. He didn't say things he didn't mean. The rest of the team filtered in over the next few days. There was Jimmy Reyes from San Antonio, who was 26 and talked about his mother's cooking the way other men talked about religion. There was Paul Garrett from rural Georgia, quiet and methodical, the best shot Thomas had ever seen and possibly would ever see. There was Corpsman Danny Cho, whose parents had come over from Korea and who had grown up in Stockton, California, and who had a genuine, unironic gift for making people laugh in situations that were not funny at all. And there was Marcus Webb from just outside Philadelphia, who was the youngest of them at 22, and who had a wife named Elaine and a 3-month-old son waiting for him back home. They called themselves Team 7, though their official designation was something longer and more bureaucratic that nobody used. They trained together for 8 months. They learned each other's rhythms, They learned who needed silence before a jump and who needed to talk. They learned who got dark and quiet under sustained pressure and who got loud and focused. They learned each other's tells. Thomas learned that Dale always ran his thumb along the edge of his wedding ring when he was worried, though Dale would never admit he was worried. He learned that Paul Garrett, despite being the calmest person on the team during a firefight, was terrified of spiders, genuinely, childlike terrified, which the rest of them found so funny that it became a sort of mascot fact, something they kept just between themselves. He learned that Jimmy Reyes kept a small photograph of his mother tucked in the breast pocket of his uniform, and that he touched it the same way a Catholic touches a scapular. They became, as men who train together and live together and depend on each other for their survival always do, a kind of family. Not the family you're born into, the family you choose, and that chooses you back, under conditions that strip away everything pretend. In early 1986, they were given their orders. The details remained classified for many years, but what Thomas has always been willing to say is this: it was an intelligence-driven mission in Central America, targeting a cache of weapons being funneled through a network that reached further than the public was ever told. It was the kind of operation that, if it worked, nobody would ever know about. If it failed, the official story would be something else entirely. They flew into a staging area in Honduras on a Tuesday night in February. The air smelled like jungle and diesel fuel. The briefing was long and detailed and left Thomas with the feeling he always got before a real operation. Not fear exactly, but a kind of hyper-alert clarity, like every sense had been turned up a notch past its normal setting. The mission profile called for a 2-day infiltration on foot through heavily forested terrain, a nighttime reconnaissance of the target compound, intelligence extraction if possible, and then exfiltration via a pre-designated pickup point 6 kilometers to the east. It was, on paper, clean. It was, in practice, something else. They moved out at 0200 on Wednesday morning. Dale was on point. Thomas was second. Paul Garrett was at the rear. 6 men, moving through darkness and dense vegetation with nothing but their training and the quiet understanding that everything depended on everything going right. The first 12 hours were clean. They covered the ground they needed to cover. They communicated in hand signals and whispers. They rested in brief, rotating intervals, 2 men awake, while the others caught whatever sleep their bodies could grab in 40-minute windows. By Thursday morning, they were within 3 kilometers of the target. That was when Jimmy Reyes, on a forward scouting position, came back with his jaw set tight and his eyes serious. "We've got a problem," he said. The compound was more heavily guarded than the intelligence had indicated. Not just more guards, more structure. Reinforced positions. A patrol rotation that covered gaps the original maps had shown as open. Either the intelligence was wrong, or something had changed recently, or someone had known they were coming. None of those options were good. Dale called a halt, and the 6 of them crouched in a tight cluster in the undergrowth and talked it through in voices barely above breath. The mission objective was still achievable. The risk profile had changed, but it hadn't become impossible. They had trained for conditions like this. They had prepared for conditions like this. But Thomas noticed something during that conversation. He noticed that Marcus Webb, the youngest, the one with a wife and the 3-month-old at home, had gone very still and very pale. Not panicking, nothing like that. Just absorbing the new information and recalculating something internal that the rest of them were recalculating too, but maybe not as loudly. Thomas leaned over and put his hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus nodded once, barely perceptibly. That was all. That was enough. They decided to proceed. The envelope on Thomas's kitchen table held 3 things. There was a letter, 3 pages long, written in blue ink in that same hand from the return address. There was a photograph, faded, shot on film, showing 6 young men in jungle gear, grinning at the camera with the kind of reckless confidence you can only manage before you've seen what you're about to see. Thomas recognized himself immediately, second from the left. He hadn't looked at a photograph of himself from that time in years. He looked young enough to break his heart. And there was a second envelope, sealed, with his name written on it in different handwriting. Handwriting he recognized. Handwriting he hadn't seen in nearly 40 years. He put the photograph down on the table. He put the second envelope down next to it. He read the letter first. It was from a woman named Carol Hutchins Pryor, Dale's daughter. She wrote that her father had passed away in November, quietly, in a hospice facility in Odessa, 2 weeks after his 81st birthday. She wrote that during his final weeks, when he was still clear-headed enough to speak. He had talked about Thomas more than he had talked about almost anyone else. He had talked about a night in 1986 that he had never fully explained to his family, but that he said he needed Thomas to know the truth about. She wrote that her father had asked her, when he was gone, to find Thomas and send him the seal, that the envelope had been written and prepared years ago and kept in the bottom of Dale's closet, sealed, waiting for this. She wrote that she didn't know what was inside. She wrote that she hoped it brought Thomas peace. Thomas put the letter down. He looked at the sealed envelope for a long time. His coffee was cold. Outside, a mockingbird was doing its thing in the dogwood tree, cycling through every sound it had ever learned. He picked up the sealed envelope and held it in both hands. The handwriting on the front, his name, his address, updated at some point from an old address to this one, in Dale's handwriting, made something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. He opened it slowly, the way you open something you know you can't close again. The night of the operation, everything that could go wrong began to go wrong in the patient, incremental way that real disaster works, not all at once, but in a sequence of small failures that compound each other until the whole structure starts to lean. The first thing was the radio. Not a total failure, more like a slow degradation in signal quality that started around midnight and got progressively worse until the transmissions back to their support were barely intelligible. They could hear fragments, could transmit fragments, but the clear, reliable communication they needed was gone, replaced by static and half sentences and the maddening uncertainty of not knowing whether your message was received. The second thing was Paul Garrett. Moving through the compound's outer perimeter in darkness, navigating a terrain that was slightly different from the reconnaissance photographs. A drainage ditch that wasn't on the maps. A coil of wire strung low between 2 posts. Paul went down. Not shot. A fall. A torn ligament in his knee that he felt go with a soft, terrible pop that he described later, in the few times he ever described it at all, as the loudest sound of the whole operation, even though it made no noise at all. He didn't make a sound when it happened. That was the training. He went down, held still, communicated the injury with a hand signal, and then got back up and kept moving, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not an option they had. But he was slower now, and they all knew it. The third thing was Marcus Webb. They had split into 2 elements to cover the target compound. Dale, Thomas, and Danny Cho in the primary element, Jimmy Reyes, Paul Garrett, and Marcus Webb in the secondary. The plan was for the secondary element to hold a support position while the primary element moved to the intelligence objective. Clean, coordinated, rehearsed, at 0340, the secondary element's position was compromised. A patrol they hadn't expected, coming from a direction that shouldn't have had a patrol, walked almost directly into Jimmy Reyes. There was contact. Brief, violent, loud enough to wake everything up for a kilometer in every direction. Thomas heard it over the radio. Not words, just the sound of it. The unmistakable audio signature of a situation going bad. And in his gut, he felt the cold, specific weight of a decision that hadn't arrived yet, but was already on its way. Then, Jimmy's voice came through the static, broken up but clear enough. Webb is down. Webb is down, I say again, Webb is. And then static. Thomas looked at Dale. In the darkness, with the compound coming alive around them, guards moving, lights sweeping. In that moment, in that fraction of a second, Dale looked back at Thomas. They were 50 meters from the intelligence objective. 50 meters. 30 years of combined training. A mission that mattered, that the people who had sent them here believed mattered, that might have consequences that stretched far beyond the 6 of them. And Marcus Webb was down somewhere in the darkness to the west, with a patrol closing in, and Jimmy Reyes and a man with a torn knee trying to hold a position that was already blown. "I'm going," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. Dale grabbed his arm. Not to stop him, Thomas understood that immediately. Just to hold on for 1 second, 1 single second, the way you hold on to something you know you're about to let go of. "Come back," Dale said. Thomas went. What followed was the longest 40 minutes of Thomas Calloway's life. He moved fast through terrain that didn't want to be moved through fast, navigating by sound and training and something that wasn't quite instinct, but was the thing that instinct becomes when it's been sharpened for long enough. He found Jimmy Reyes behind a fallen tree, working his radio with one hand and holding pressure on his own left arm with the other. A graze. Not deep, but bleeding steadily. Marcus Webb was 15 meters further back. He was alive. He had taken a round through his left thigh, high up, close to the femoral. Danny Cho, who had somehow navigated to the same position in the chaos, was already working on him by the time Thomas arrived, applying a tourniquet with the rapid, practiced efficiency of a man who has done this in the dark before. "He's stable," Danny said quietly. For now was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Thomas made the call that he had to make. They couldn't move Marcus at speed. They couldn't stay where they were. The exfiltration route to the east was the only option, but it meant a 6-kilometer movement with a man who couldn't walk, through terrain that was now actively being searched. He got on the radio, barely functional, barely anything, and transmitted their position and situation back toward Dale's element, knowing he might be transmitting into nothing. Knowing Dale might not receive it. Knowing Dale was still back there with the mission objective and no support element, and whatever decisions he was now making on his own. They moved. Jimmy carried Marcus's rifle. Thomas and Danny carried Marcus, one on each side, his arms over their shoulders and his feet dragging and his teeth clenched against sounds that would have gotten them all killed. Paul Garrett, moving on a knee that had to be screaming, covered their rear. They moved for 4 hours through the dark and the heat and the undergrowth. Thomas stopped counting the distance. He stopped thinking about anything except the next 20 meters. And then the 20 meters after that. His legs burned. His shoulders burned. The man beside him, a 22-year-old kid with a wife and a son, breathed in ragged, controlled increments that told Thomas everything he needed to know about the kind of will it takes to keep going when your body is arguing very loudly for a different outcome. Marcus Webb survived. They got him to the extraction point with 20 minutes to spare before the helicopter arrived. He lost the leg, eventually, not from the wound itself, but from complications in the weeks that followed, a decision made in a hospital in Texas that Thomas didn't learn about until months later. But he survived. Jimmy Reyes's arm healed clean. Paul Garrett's knee required surgery and ended his operational career, but he walked without a limp within a year. Dale Hutchins completed the mission objective alone, then exfiltrated through an alternate route that wasn't in the original plan, and that he improvised in real time with a compass, a paper map, and 32 years of experience. He reached a secondary pickup point 6 hours after the rest of them were already out. When Thomas finally saw him at the debrief, Dale sat down across the table from him and looked at him for a long moment, and then said, very quietly, "I almost didn't let you go." "I know," Thomas said. "You made the right call," Dale said. Thomas never knew, for certain, whether Dale believed that. Dale never said it again, and for 37 years, Thomas carried the question of what Dale had really thought about that night, whether he had truly believed it, or whether he had said it because that was what needed to be said, and whether there was a difference. The letter inside the sealed envelope was 4 pages long, written in Dale's handwriting, dated 2019. Thomas read it twice. The second time, he put it down on the kitchen table and sat very still for a while. In the letter, Dale wrote about that night. He wrote about the moment Thomas said, "I'm going." He wrote that in the second he held Thomas's arm, he had run the calculation, mission objective versus his man, the order versus the brother, and that he had reached a conclusion in that single second that he had never told anyone. He had concluded that Thomas was right. Not because the mission didn't matter, it did, but because Dale had a philosophy, built over 25 years in special operations, that he had never been able to fully articulate to anyone, that the mission was always the abstract thing, and the man beside you was always the real thing, and that when you got them confused, you had already lost something more important than any objective on any map. He wrote that he had spent years worried that Thomas blamed himself for compromising the mission, that the intelligence they didn't retrieve had consequences. It did. Dale was clear about that. He didn't soften it. There were consequences. But he wanted Thomas to know that the alternative, leaving Marcus Webb in that field, would have had consequences too, of a different kind. The kind that don't show up in any after-action report. He wrote, "I've thought about that night maybe 10,000 times, and every time, I think you made the only decision a man with any real sense of what we were doing could have made. You chose the thing that was real over the thing that was abstract. That's not a failure of the mission. That's what the mission was always supposed to be about." He wrote, "I should have told you this 30 years ago. I was too proud, or too stubborn, or too much of a fool. I'm telling you now, because I'm old enough to know that the things you don't say outlive the things you do." He wrote, "I'm glad you were my brother. I'm glad we went where we went. I'm glad we came back." And at the bottom, in a slightly shakier hand than the rest of the letter, the hand of a man writing something in his last chapter, he wrote, "Don't carry it anymore. You've carried it long enough." Thomas Calloway sat at his kitchen table for a long time. He looked at the photograph of 6 young men grinning in the jungle, not yet knowing what was coming for them. He looked at Dale's face in the photograph, that wide, confident face, that laugh you could see even in a still image. He thought about Marcus Webb, who lived in Phoenix now, and had 2 daughters, and walked with a prosthetic, and coached his younger daughter's softball team. Thomas knew this because he had tracked Marcus down years ago, written him letters, received letters back. They weren't close. The distance between 2 men who shared a night that bad and then went in different directions can be hard to close. But they were something. They were connected by something that didn't require regular maintenance to stay intact. He thought about Jimmy Reyes, who had died of a heart attack in 2009, too young, in the same San Antonio where he'd been born, and whose mother, the one whose cooking Jimmy had talked about the way other men talked about religion, had outlived him by 7 years. He thought about Paul Garrett, who lived somewhere in Virginia, and who Thomas had last spoken to at a mutual friend's funeral in 2015, and who had shaken Thomas's hand with both of his and said, "Still here?" And Thomas had said, "Still here." And that had been sufficient. He thought about Danny Cho, who had become a physician and practiced emergency medicine in Sacramento for 30 years, and who sent Thomas a Christmas card every year without fail. The same card. Always a picture of a snowy landscape and a brief handwritten note that said the same thing every year. Still thinking of you and the boys. He thought about Dale Hutchins, who was gone now, who had kept a letter in the bottom of his closet for years and asked his daughter to send it when he was finished, who had done, in the end, what he had always done, made sure the men around him had what they needed. Thomas stood up from the kitchen table. His knees complained, the way they did now every morning. He went to the window and looked out at the vegetable garden, at the tomato plants coming in, at the ordinary and irreplaceable morning light coming over the ridge. He had been carrying a question for 37 years. A small, persistent question that sat at the back of everything, not loud enough to ruin a day, but present enough to never fully let one go. Whether he had made the right call, whether Dale had forgiven him something, or believed there was nothing to forgive, or had simply been too disciplined to let it show. Now, he knew. He pulled on his boots. He went out to the garden. He worked for an hour in the early morning light, doing what needed to be done, the way he always did. Then, he went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and wrote a letter to Carol Hutchins Pryor in Odessa, Texas. He thanked her for sending the envelope. He told her a few things about her father, not the operational things. Those still weren't his to share. And anyway, they weren't the important things. He told her that Dale Hutchins was the most genuinely decent man he had ever known. He told her that Dale had a way of making the men around him better, not through orders or authority, but through the simple fact of how he lived, and that this was rarer than it sounded, and that the world had needed more of it than it had ever gotten. He told her that her father had given him something he didn't know he still needed, that he was grateful. He sealed the letter. He put it on the counter by the door so he'd take it when he drove into town. Then, he made a fresh pot of coffee, poured a cup, and went back out to the porch. He sat in his chair. He watched the ridge. The mockingbird was back in the dogwood tree. He breathed. There is something that happens between men in extreme circumstances, something that has no adequate word for it in ordinary language. It is not friendship exactly, because friendship implies choice made in comfort, and this is a choice made under fire. It is not love exactly, because love implies a tenderness that this thing doesn't always have room for. It is closer to a vow, one that is never spoken, because speaking it would diminish it, would make it sound like something smaller than it is. A vow that says, I am here, and I see you, and if the worst comes, I will not leave you behind. And the vow goes both ways, always, or it means nothing. Thomas Calloway had made that vow to 6 men in 1986, and they had made it back to him, and most of them had kept it, and the ones who hadn't were human beings under impossible pressure, doing the best they could with what they had, and that had always been enough. It had always been enough. He had carried the weight of that night for 37 years, not because he had failed his team, but because the weight itself was the vow, the ongoing proof that he remembered, that he hadn't let go, that the night mattered, and the men in it mattered, and the choices made in the dark mattered, even if no one outside of that handful of people would ever know the specifics. Dale had been right. He had carried it long enough. But he understood now, sitting in the morning light on the back porch of his small house in Kingsport, Tennessee, that he wouldn't put it down entirely. He would carry it differently. Lighter, the way you carry something that has been re-understood, not a burden anymore, but a weight that reminds you of its own significance. The way a wedding ring is heavy on the hand of someone who chose well. The sun was fully up now, and the garden was green and real and requiring nothing from him except attention. He finished his coffee. He was still here. The bravest thing about the men who carry these stories is not that they survived. It is that they went back, every morning, back to the ordinary life, the small house, the quiet coffee, the garden that needs tending, back to a world that doesn't know what was traded to keep it intact, and that doesn't need to know, and that is the point. The debt owed to men like these is not repayable, but it can be remembered. It can be honored. And that perhaps is the only promise worth making, not that their sacrifice will never be forgotten, but that the people who came after them will try every day to be worth what it cost